Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session. My name is Kavita. This is Sonali. We're here to discuss Sonali's work. Uh, Her recent book, Glass Bottom, is going to be the center of our discussion today. And we're both journalists. But Sonali, other than doing mainstream journalism, she also works with the art, different forms of art to tell stories. So we're going to discuss with her basically her work in journalism, but mainly also how she uses different forms of art to tell stories. And then we come to the book itself. So, welcome to the session, Sonali. My first question to you would be what, other than journalism, what kind of art forms have you used to tell stories over the years?
I'm very glad to be here with you, Kavita. There are a lot of spaces in which our work converge and collide. So, my compositions have looked at social, environmental, and scientific issues. And the medium that they've taken have ranged from visual art, long form reporting, investigative reporting, installation art. Now, with this book, you have the novel writing, but it's also very experimental novels. You have a little bit of prose, you have poetry, you have snippets of a play. So I really see the form being a very fluid space for me to experiment. It really depends on how I want to express the story and the scope of the story per se.
So, I just wanted to ask you because I'm just personally also interested to know can you just share like a story of choosing a certain art form to tell a certain story better, if there's some personal experience that you'd like to share with, like, thinking of why you'd go for a certain art form and not the other to tell a certain story.
I think the perfect example to discuss that would be this book, right? So I had been doing work as an environmental climate reporter and had nearly a decade worth of field experience related to that. And when I sat down with this feeling of holding a lot of stories close to me, I could literally feel the heaviness of that, and I wanted to express it through a single form. It required a space that would let me be, or let allow the complexity of character, allow the complexity of emotions, allow me to look at different aspects of the ecological issue. And I think for that, the novel form or the book form is beautiful in that sense, because there is incomplete experiences that you can look at. There are emotional nuances to a character, which perhaps a non-fictional narrative or a reporting narrative does not give you, because it's generally one person's statement via, against another person's statement. But in fiction, you can look at the complexities of a character. You can look at the long shadows of an event. It doesn't have to be just the now and the present of a disaster. It can be the past of a disaster. It can be the future consequences of a disaster. So there is a lot of magical thinking in the book, and also the practice of novel writing as well. It's a very hopeful exercise, novel writing. So I think that was what I used to kind of express the heaviness that I was feeling with all these stories I had reported over nearly a decade.
Also, I was reading a number of reviews of the book, and I saw that people have like called it different things. People have called it environmental fiction, the genre. They've called it climate fiction. They've called it eco-feminist fiction. They've called it literary fiction. And I was thinking, like, as a writer, as the author, do you what genre would you call this is there like a genre that you would label it as?
I don't think that it's not any of those, but I don't think it's only that. I never wrote with a genre in mind. I think that is shown in the form the book takes, that it doesn't follow one simple way of telling a story. And I resist the idea of a book belonging to a single genre, because if you are writing a climate story, it is going to be drama. If you're writing a climate story, it can be poetry. If you're writing a climate story, it can be a political story. It can be a political thriller. So they all overlap. you're not talking about a remote setting where, it's the same thing when people write about nature, they don't understand that we are part of it. So it reflects in how we talk about books, how we sell books, how we write books. And I was adamant about not doing that. I wanted to tell a story, and it fits wherever it fits. And I'm someone who doesn't encourage myself to read reviews because I believe that's the experience of the reader. But I would say that, yeah, if that is how you perceive it, well and good. But for me as a writer, I just wanted to write. The genre was not a question in my head.
So, just to talk about the book a little, the book is also set very much just like this very own setting. It is set by the Arabian Sea, just like Kozhikode. And we have four women protagonists in the book. They are two mother-daughter pairs. Um, their lives don't meet, like the two pairs don't meet each other in the book. But one is a working class lady. She works in a salon. The other in a beauty parlor. The other lady is a geology scholar. Her daughter works with the arts. One is working class. The other is affluent, and we see that there's a storm brewing, and then in the in this backdrop of the storm brewing, the complexities of the lives of these four women unfold before us through the book. And we have the sea, which is exploited by the patriarchal society or the patriarchal mindset and men, just like the women in the book. So there is this strong ecofeminist perspective that comes across from the book. And there are very clear parallels that Sonali draws, where she talks about how women and nature both are exploited, are at the receiving end of what patriarchy has to offer us as a society. So, my question, Sonali, to you is that can you just explain this thought of both women and nature being at the bearing the brunt of patriarchy in our society, like either from the book or from your professional or personal experiences? If you could just explain this to us.
Yeah, that's a very loaded question. I think I'll start by saying that it's not that the book is devoid of men or male characters. I think they exist, but they do not exist as the salvation of a female character. They do not exist as a solution to a problem. They're much more atmospheric. Spoilers, but there's a juvenile whale shark. It's a male whale shark, and then a boy goes missing. So there are male characters, but they're very much like the weather. They affect the female characters, but they don't necessarily very directly impose on them. Um, and I think we have to recognize that I'm not talking about the female experience in a silo. Uh, but they're not dictated by the male characters who tend to be very aggressively portrayed in our media as the main point of focus. Regarding women and nature, if you report on any crisis issue or any ecological issue on the field, you will realize that the women are disproportionately holding the burden of a crisis or an ecological rupture. I went to cover the 15th anniversary of the Indian Ocean tsunami. Um, there was a 9.0 earthquake, right? And the tsunami waves kind of washed up on like a dozen shores across countries. And Aceh in Indonesia is a small place, was flattened out by the tsunami. And I went to small villages where I saw that there were men I was interviewing and they were all widowers. I wondered what happened to the women. Like, why are there just clusters of widowers I'm finding everywhere? And then I found a report that said that the women that claimed that the women disproportionately died in larger numbers as compared to the men. And that fact haunted me for so long because then I started exploring why. Of course, the obvious factor is their costume, their garb, their daily wear, the sari or the hijab or whatever the women don is not conducive when a tsunami hits. Culturally, they're not taught to swim. They are the fisherwomen, the fisher folk who take care of trade on land, but they don't necessarily go into the sea. The sea is a male frontier. The fisherman, he goes with his son. The daughter never goes. Uh, And the third most important thing is our cultural mindset, right? So when the wave came, the men very instinctively knew that they have to run uphill and inland, and they did that. They must have been at work or otherwise, and they did that. But the women who are caregivers, uh, who look after the elderly and the young and the newborn, their instinct was not to run. They basically huddled around their family members and they stayed put, and they got washed away. And when they were found tangled in household debris, in electric poles. Very disturbingly, you saw them, their hair matted and tangled in all these objects. Whereas the men, they very naturally knew what to do. So that made me question the very psychological idea of, embodying a female experience. Like, what does it mean to go through these ruptures, to survive as a female body? And even without the physical props of society that stop us, that there's a social imprisonment that I saw happening when disasters run around. During floods, girls don't have places to go to the bathroom, and when they have their period, they wash their clothes in the dirty flood water and they use it. And there are so many infection cases. Again, this is something that bothers you, like bleeding into dirty flood water. And nobody thinks about that. When it's not the first concern when people discuss policy or cover floods. So, and it's so disturbing to me because that's our daily existence, and still we find ways to live and survive. In the book, a storm happens, but it's by no means the focus or the crux of the book. There's so much happening that nothing really becomes the turning point. And when the women find themselves in the cyclone shelter, Looney, who works at a beauty parlor, doesn't know what to do. And so she starts making eyebrows. She's threading other women's eyebrows in the cyclone shelter while there's a storm brewing. Because that's what women do. They talk about kal kya banega, like what you're gonna cook after the storm finishes, how do you clean, you have to send your kid to school, whether it's an ecological rupture or a social rupture. I was talking to Rahul, who's here, like during the Shaheen Bagh protest, the women were preparing food, sending their kids to school, and then coming and protesting at night. It becomes an everyday ritual. So that I found something that was very moving and actually educated me about my body and my experience a lot by just looking at how women everywhere look at and live through rupture.
And what about environment being exploited by men, like that aspect?
Yeah, that is also true. I think there is the distinction between land and water. Like, how do you draw the boundary between land and water? There's a very interesting. I was looking at this lecture where this professor talked about the concept of wetness. He said there is no distinction between land and water. Water at its depth is land, and when everything floods, it's going to be water, right? So he said that's a very man-made distinction. Okay, this is the line, this is the shoreline, this is the riverbank. Because again, when it floods, we have started constructing on floodplains, right? So the idea of what a shoreline or a riverbank looks like, it's a very man-made and male construct that kind of influences zoning ideas, construction, and everything. And he thought, like, let's look at the idea of wetness as a degree. Like, you look at how an area gets more and more wet as we progress, and that's how he described defining what land and water is. So the basic distinction is also a male construct, and then they don't even stick to that. So there's a section in the book where there's a hotel on the shore, right? And they're told to map the high tide line. The high tide line is where the maximum ingress of a wave. So to understand that, okay, construction should not happen in that area. And the scientists and the government officials, and this is actually real life reporting. I went to Goa and did the story. The high tide line just magically bends where the hotel is. Like, if it's going like this, it suddenly skews far into the sea when the hotel is, and you're like, what is happening? Like, why did you do that? But if you actually, the citizens then mapped it, and the line actually falls right into the compound of the five-star hotel where all the weddings take place and all the nice photos of flowy gowns happen, the high tide line right falls right into the property's compound. So they make the rules, but then they're the ones who break it as well. And they are the ones who just skew it whichever way they like, depending upon their needs. So of course, it's the exploitation is run, governed, and influenced by men.
So while you, that was a very nuanced answer. Thank you. Firstly, while you talk about themes that we can draw, like we can see that you're talking about earthquakes, you're talking about the environment, you're talking about women, you're talking about sadness, loss, but there are also the mundane that you talk about. Like the book has a lot of everyday things, like regular things. It's not like a regular story arc where you start at a certain point and it follows a certain track and reaches a certain point. It's a lot of mundane with a lot that can make sense as well. I wanted to ask you about this choice of also focusing on the mundane.
Um, yeah. So basically, I do not really subscribe to the beginning, middle, and end part of a story. I don't think that's how we live our lives. I think um, it's something that we observe in retrospect. No, we look at something and we like, acha, yahan, we started here, we are in the middle of this, and then we ended here. But it never happens when we are living. It's you are in the middle of a story at all points in your life till the very end, right? And of course, there's the distinct beginning, but at the most part of our life, we're in the middle of the story. Um, and then the idea of focusing on the mundane is basically, and this is something I spoke about yesterday also, that the female expression of surviving is very closely associated with the act of witness. What we do on a daily basis uh, is at the very miniature level, the intricate detail, the smallest detail of like what someone is bringing to the cyclone shelter, what they think is worth preserving or saving if the rupture occurs. It's a female doctor that observes, okay, she brought a pair of tongs from her kitchen. Somebody brought an empty cigarette packet, phantom cigarettes. Someone bought a surgical glove box. Like, why are people bringing these unusual items into the cyclone shelter, and what does it say about them? So she notices that, and she's an end of life palliative care doctor, so her lens is very different when she looks at life and suffering. I think so. Basically, the essential idea of the book was around the idea of the fold, which is basically how things fold into each other and how we are basically folds of landscape. So Agnes Varda was a very famous filmmaker. She said if we opened each other up, we'd be landscapes, right? And then there's this French philosopher called Deleuze who talks about the fold, the inside being a fold of the outside. And he quotes this other writer who says that the fold is nothing but an interiority of exception and anticipation. And I found my female characters doing both, right? They are the exception in the sense that they're still surviving, that they've not been swept away by a rupture. And we are all part of the exception because we are here after the pandemic. But at the same time, you're in anticipation of rupture. You're living anticipatory grief for the most time because you're always looking at the next thing that's going to go wrong. You are living it. And as a reporter, as a writer, I think most of my life is lived in anticipatory grief. You're anticipating the next big colossal loss. But at the same, there's the third thing that's missing. So the fold is an interiority of exception and anticipation. I postulate that the feminine fold is an interiority of witness, irrespective of the gender that performs it. Because when you witness something, there's a blurring of the inside and outside, the object that you're witnessing and the person witnessing it. Whereas the very masculine fold or gaze, there's a clear distinction that this is my object, this is the objectified person or object of gaze, and this is the person witnessing it. So there's a very straight distinction between the two. But that's not how witnessing works. You imbibe a lot of what you see, and as reporters, we know that we are not the same after every story. So this blurring of the idea, the separation of the two, as well as the unity that happens, and you complicate that further by including compassion, care, and coping mechanisms, you end up with the feminine form. You end up with the feminine fold. That is why the mundane objects are there. Because when you witness all of it. You just don't look at the big picture, the big idea, and that's it. You actually focus on the small, small parts that make a day, that make a life. And that's the whole book. The book describes the act of witness. That's what it does.
So my next question is about you like while the book is dense and dark, it is also funny and witty at several places. And there are these one-liners that really stand out at every other page. So there's one where this guard dog is called Juice by by the keepers when the name is Zeus, actually,
Yeah.
right? And then there's this leader who you've called the leader of the art of outliving.
Yeah.
And then we know where that comes from. And then something dark, if I want to share, and I quote, you say, Arth, who is one of the protagonists, Arth had read about a girl who danced all night around the bonfire of her own leg. She knew women who had saved trees but had forgotten how to scream. So I want to know if you have certain sections of the book that could be dark, could be witty, that stand out for you personally, that you would probably like to share with us.
Yeah. I really like the art of outliving because that came to me towards the end of the book. So I was looking at the floodplains and the construction of the floodplains, and the art of living was right there in every reporting. And I said, okay, we focus so much on living, and then when something happens, you always talk about outliving a certain catastrophe. And outliving in all connotations is not good. You don't need to outlive everything. The idea of surviving also indicates what you are the exception to the rule. I always wonder, like, why did I make it past the pandemic and why did someone else not make it? Like, what is the cosmic logic behind it, right? So this focus on outliving everything past, or every family member, this focus on outliving all societal ruptures doesn't sit well with me, right? It's the same idea of creating art that's permanent, that will last all the time, um, that cannot be temporary, that cannot exist in a certain context. No, it has to be that. Longevity is such a potent point of discussion in our society, and it has detrimental aspects to it. So, of course, art of outliving is one, but my favorite has to be the clowns. When I was writing this book, uh, so at some point in my life, there was a fancy dress competition as a very young person, and my mother did not know what to dress me as. So overnight there were dungarees, and she like sewed on patches on the dungarees. She gave me like very grotesque makeup, and she's like, "Okay, you're the Joker. You go and be the Joker," and I won. And I still have that photograph with me, and somehow I think she prophesized what I'll be in life, because the next fancy dress competition I was the journalist, the boycott, and now I'm both. I am the Joker and the journalist, right? And the clown for me, so that was one aspect, but the clown for me holds a bigger question. So this Italian filmmaker Federico Fellini, he said that the clown is a caricature of the well-ordered society. So when everything is in order, the clown is the designated spectacle. Everybody comes to see the clown making a fool of himself, herself, and you laugh and you joke around, you poke the clown and you leave, right? But what happens to the role of the clown when the society completely is in chaos and is very absurd and grotesque in general? So when the clown becomes obsolete because your politicians are the spectacles and the specters, when your bureaucrats are the spectacles and specter, what is the role of the fool when everyone plays a fool? And in my head, they become the philosophers. They become the philosophers of loss. They become the philosophers of survival. They teach you the act of forgiveness. And so there are two clowns in the book, Smiley and Copycat, that come to one of the characters, Arth, who's very aptly named Arth because you can look at the English language connotation of Arth and the Hindi language, which is meaning. And they come to her at very potent moments in her life, and they teach her the act of forgiveness. And they do so with their, comical antics. But in the end, it's a very, very moving message that, um, It's not a very easy act in today's life. And I think it's Copycat that was looking at the death of a orca whale called Lolita, and he actually uses the death of the whale to talk about forgiveness. That what happens when a whale in captivity is actually let out to live her final years? Can she practice the act of forgiveness towards the human population? So I love the jokers. The jokers are everywhere. Love them.
So, my question now is that the style of writing is not a very regular style of writing.
Yes.
There has to be a particular reader to read the book.
Yes.
When we write journalistic pieces, sometimes it's for the general audience, sometimes it's not.
Mhm.
Sometimes it is very, very, you know who you're writing for at this point. This book is for somebody. There is a reader out there.
Yeah.
I want you to define that reader for us.
I think this book is for everybody. I don't think I had a reader in mind. I believe what you're talking about is like the accessibility of reading. Like it's not an easily digestible book. And I think it's very deceptive because it's so short. Like everybody thinks they can finish it in a month or two, and then they're like sitting with it after 3 months. And I keep getting messages like, I'm still on chapter so and so, and I can't like. I think what this book demands or first what it resists is easy translation. The experience of the female characters doesn't translate very easily when you're reading it. And what it encourages is attention. Because what does easy translation do? When there is easy translation, there's easy consumption. You read something, you move on to the next page. My characters and I, we resist the easy consumption of desire, of violence, of loss, or pain, and that we do through different medias. No, you scroll, you see mass killings, and then you see something that points to desire, and then something else that points to melancholy. But that's what we resist. We don't want the easy consumption of desire and violence. Number one, and number two is you don't have to be transparent about your experiences at all time, because transparency leads to the susceptibility of being subjected to violence. When somebody or someone or some party claims to fully understand you, or you're fully readable to them, you are open to conquest, you're open to being exploited. So the female characters are not very opaque in their experience. You wonder like why a lot of backstory is not given to them at certain points, and the form itself enacts that. So at certain points in the book, if you don't understand it completely, if there's only a part of the book that you understand, if it's only partially being revealed to you, I think that's perfectly fine, because then the form, the book, enacts that protective gesture and gives those characters the opacity that they need to survive. I don't want you to understand the characters completely at all times. You should be able to live with a partial understanding of someone and still be able to care for them. The whole idea, and I was reading about this writer Aruna D'Souza, I think she wrote about imperfect solidarities. The idea that you need to completely understand someone to empathize with them and hence care and raise your voice is why most of our big protests are failing. You need to be able to care for them even if you don't understand them, because caring is a basic human emotion. It's the basic act of solidarity. It should not be dependent upon understanding. And that's why the book is perhaps not easily legible to everybody, but it is for everybody. You just need to give it time. Give it the gift of time and attention, and I believe she will stay with you. Yeah.
So, the book has there's literary prose that you use, and there are poems. So, I was just thinking that is there like were there inspirations in literature that you were kind of drawing from, like to go with the to decide on the style of the writing? If you could share some of those inspirations with us.
So the writing is not necessarily modeled after a specific writer or artist, but I can tell you the bigger picture, the people I read or the figures that I gravitate towards, and they're not just writers. So there is this deaf artist, Christine Sun Kim. I really like her art, just kind of haunts me because it's so simple but so potent. You have greats like Aga Shahid Ali. His poem actually makes it into the text in a very different form. You have Toni Morrison. I believe she's one of the best writers we've ever had, best nature writers we've ever had. You have T.S. Eliot, you have Roland Barthes. There's so many people who are mentioned in the end. But the writing kind of takes its own shape. I think that was the problem. They couldn't map it as being the contemporary of so and so figure. And they kept asking me, like, who, when you sell a book or when you describe a book, they're like, if you are a fan of Charles Dickens, you will like so and so. They couldn't write anything like that about my book. They were like, it's extremely weird. And I kind of like that about it. It's my weird baby. So I like that about it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I just wanted to open for questions. If there are any questions.
Hi. So we spoke yesterday, Sonali, and I had a question. I mean, it occurred to me as you were talking right now about people who've read the book saying 2 months later they're on chapter 3 and everything. And you've spoken about form and the way you wanted to approach how you told these stories. I'm just curious, this the I guess the act of writing it at some level, a book of the kind that you're doing is also an act of discovery, what you want to put in, what you want to keep out,
Yeah.
and more importantly, the shape you want to give it. Um, so how did you? So I know I look, it's a lot more complicated than you can probably answer right now, but how did you sort of come at this particular format and give it this particular form that you wanted to keep the weirdness in there, the sense of incompleteness? Did, was it did you have different approaches where you were saying let's try the complete approach first and then said no, doesn't work? What was that like? Just
Yeah.
take us through that a little bit.
Yeah. So I think it's a very I'll answer that with a personal anecdote. So I, as an individual living in today's world, struggled with feeling too much. Like I'm always at capacity when I'm surviving because there's so much happening, and I tend to kind of internalize everything as a human being. So much so that it makes living and interacting with family members and friends harder. And I think one of the characters has the same issue. She's always overwhelmed with disasters, right? Arth. Uh, and I was writing, or at least doing a draft of a book during the pandemic, which is again colossal grief. You're holding so much grief within you. So I needed to express that. And very instinctively, I'd never thought that, okay, this section of the book has to be play, or this section of the book has to be prose. It was what I was writing at that time and what I was feeling at that time, regards to what is happening outside my home, the people that were falling sick left, right, and center in Delhi. At some point, both my parents and I had COVID together, and there was no vaccine at that time, so we were just worried that whether all three of us would make it. And poetry came to me at that time. I remember reading T.S. Eliot to just survive. The four quartets kept me alive at that time. So when I came out of it, my first go was at poetry, and I wrote a lot of the poetic pieces of the book. Then probably at a much more therapeutic post-recovery phase, I tried the prose sections. So it really reflects what I was going through. And at my hardest moments, it's always been poetry. I think it's a very purified form of emotion, right? So you just need to relate, and you need to relate quick in a couple of sentences to someone. So yeah, when it came together, I think when the editor had read it, so to say, she said it made sense, but really it didn't make sense to me till it was completely done. I just knew I was writing about this particular scene, and I had to write it in this way. For example, there is so when Earth has these disasters that keep coming to her, basically she's first of all a consumer of news. She loves reading the news, right? So that does something to her psyche. She thinks about those disasters when she's eating food with her mom, and she feels that her mom is like overindulging when there is scarcity somewhere else. And she comes up with these specters, these ghosts that haunt her, the chalky ones, she calls them. And when she interacts with them, it's not necessarily prose form. Sometimes she shares a play she's writing and she talks about hunger in a very magical realism kind of way. Sometimes it's a question, sometimes it's poetry that she's sharing. So, and I believe that's how we talk to our specters. We don't necessarily sit and talk in one way. Sometimes it's an open letter. Like, you know, you deal with your ghosts in very different ways because the ghosts are different. And then, of course, the book is broken down in the middle by a long poem as well that kind of encapsulates both parts. So, yeah, I think the form is necessarily it's dictated by the event that takes place. And one more thing I'll say: there's this very painfully beautiful section where Earth is cremating her grandfather, and she goes to the crematorium, and the Hindus use mango wood as an auspicious quality of wood that they use for cremating a loved one. And the worker at the crematorium said that they're running out of wood. They don't have enough stock of mango wood. And she's like, why? Like, is it deforestation? Why don't you have enough wood? And the guy says that the village they generally get that wood from, on the mango trees, there have been an increased cases of hangings. Either the farmers are hanging themselves or their daughters are hanging. And so once the wood is tainted by a hanging, by a suicide or a rape killing or whatever, they don't use that wood. And with that, then again, this gushing specter of the Badam case comes to her. And she talks about her dad, her father, who was unable to cut down the daughter because the police has not arrived. And instead, they all kind of are caught in this reverie of when all this will finish and the longing of the fruit will come back. When the violence will pass, and you can go back to longing the mango as a sticky fruit of pleasure, you know, the villagers is just thinking that. So they're so used to the violence that they're just looking towards desire, looking towards pleasure in that moment when the police has not arrived yet. So even in moments of prose, there's beautiful poetry, and it helps me hold my pain better. Yeah. Yeah.